Good afternoon. My name's Amy Ingalls. I'm going to be your moderator today. We want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to welcome you to the webinar today. The University of Illinois is extremely happy to be partnering with the Institute for Government and Public Affairs. We're bringing to you today's presentation called the Toolbox Fundamentals. This is a webinar. This is the first webinar in a series based on the Illinois Budget Policy Toolbox. Extension's partnership with groups like IGPA allows us to bring programming through our local government education and information network. So we want to thank our community and economic development team as a whole, but I especially just want to thank today Kathy Brown, Ken Larimore, Corey Buttry, Chris Casey, and Ann Silvis. Just a few housekeeping items for everyone on the call today. We have a lot of great information for you today in a short amount of time. So we ask that you just hold your questions until the end, and we're going to have time for question and answers for all the presenters. But we're going to allow them to go ahead through their presentations one by one. So with that, we're going to begin. I'll give you an introduction to Dr. Christopher Mooney. He is the director of the University of Illinois Institute of Government and Public Affairs and the W. Russell Arlington Professor of State Politics. He's a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, studies comparative U.S. state politics and special focus on state legislatures. Founding editor of the top academic journal in his field, State Politics and Policy Quarterly, directed the Institute for Legislative Studies at UIS from 1999 to 2004. He has also taught at West Virginia State University, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and the University of Essex in the UK. So with no further ado, to introduce the upcoming, or this webinar series, we want to introduce Dr. Mooney.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Amy, and welcome to everybody on the call today. As Amy said, I'm Chris Mooney, and I'm director of the IGPA. We're here today to talk about the Illinois budget woes and our budget policy toolbox, which is our effort to make to pitch in on this a bit. The IGPA is the University of Illinois' public policy think tank with a focus on the state of Illinois. We bring the resources of the U of I to bear on the public problems of the state. We've got a long history of working on public finance. We've got many economists who have over the years spent a good deal of time working on the state studying the state economies, pensions, budgets, spending, and so forth. Most recently, I'll get ahead a little bit here. Most recently, we have been working. We have a subset of economists in our group working on a project called the Fiscal Futures Project, which is run by Dave Merriman, who's on the call today, and Richard Dye. And they brought our attention in the last few years to the extremely serious nature of the fiscal problems of the state. And the Illinois State Budget Policy Toolbox is our attempt to help inform the public conversation in Illinois about various aspects of this situation in this particularly crucial year, not only crucial for the fiscal crisis, but with the gubernatorial election that's going to make, the voters are going to make some big decisions on. The State Budget Policy Toolbox is a website that consists of short pieces of analysis on three basic topics: background issues about the economy and where we are today, and these are issues we'll talk about today. Revenue options, which will be the subject of June's topic, or June's webinar, and spending options, which will be the subject of August's webinar. These analyses were written for smart newspaper readers. That's our sort of target audience, not economists, not political scientists. These are providing information that informed voters should know, pros, cons, impacts, etc., about these issues. In addition, staff members, policymakers, the media also are important target audiences of these analyses. In addition to the analyses on these subjects, many of them, about half of them or so, we've spun off commentaries that have been published in various places around the state over the last few months. Newspapers, public radio. We've got a couple of articles in Illinois Issues magazine. Each of the topics has a further reading section and so forth. And so today what we're going to do is offer a few insights from some of these analyses, and then we'll offer plenty of time for Q&A. And you can also see this on this page that you're seeing now. It's got the URL for the toolbox, and I encourage you after the webinar to go through, and there's a lot of stuff going on in there, a lot of information. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague David Merriman, who is a faculty member at IGPA and the Department of Public Administration at UIC. He's an economist with his degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is a fantastic graduate school, I can assure you. And he is also a member of Governor Quinn's Council of Economic Advisors, and you can read his bio there. So, David? You there, David?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Oh, sorry.
Yes, sorry, we can hear you.
Okay, and there you can see me just briefly, and so I'll turn off my video. Thanks very much, Chris. And yeah, and I appreciate Chris's discussion of the Fiscal Futures Project, which is really the background in which we did all of this work. And so, in general, my task here is to talk about the context in which these decisions have to be made. So I want to talk about the economic situation and the fiscal situation, and those are very closely intertwined. Generally, when a state has a weak economy, it's also going to have difficult fiscal situation. Although what Illinois' particular history has been is that even when we've had a strong economy, we haven't managed the fiscal situation terribly well, and that's contributed to some of our problems. So I want to talk first about Illinois' economy, and people sometimes lose sight in the kind of doom and gloom of the fact that Illinois actually is a pretty strong state. It's historically had, this just shows the median household income in Illinois, and it's historically been above the national average. That's the red line, and the blue line is the U.S. national average. And what you can see there is that we fluctuate around the national average, and sometimes we've soared significantly above it, other times we're much closer to it. But I don't think, in looking at this picture, what you get is kind of a death spiral. Right now, Illinois is not doing, it's a little bit better than the national average, but not doing terribly well. But one of the things that we have to remember is that typically in recessions, Illinois does worse than the national average, or that is, it feels recession somewhat harder. But then in boom periods, it does somewhat better. So anyway, the Illinois economy has been mostly better than the U.S. economy, but in recent times we have some real pause about that. This shows the unemployment rate in Illinois and the nation as a whole. And what you see here is, again, the Illinois unemployment rate tends to track the nation as a whole. But the kind of frightening thing is, if you look at us from 2011, and particularly beginning in 2013, the Illinois unemployment rate is significantly above the national unemployment rate. And so there's some real cause for concern about whether we're diverging from historic patterns, which has been to be kind of a little bit higher income state than the rest of the country. in particular, what we've seen is the lack of job growth in Illinois. So this shows the civilian labor force and employing non-farm payrolls over the past several years, from before the Great Recession in 2008 until recent times. And what you see is that, like the rest of the country, Illinois lost a lot of jobs in 2008 with the Great Recession. But the rest of the country, we can see employment coming back. Illinois, we don't see employment coming back very much. And in particular, again, starting in the beginning of 2013, we see continued job losses in Illinois while the rest of the country is picking up. So a real concern is whether Illinois' economy has again diverged from its historic patterns, and whether it's in more trouble than it's been in the past. There's been a lot of ink about why this might be. One concern is that the general fiscal situation, and in particular sort of the pessimism about the fiscal situation, has led to some of these kind of job losses, the instability and the pessimism about the fiscal situation. It's difficult to say with any kind of scientific precision that that's what's causing the dismal economic performance, but it's at least a potential, it's certainly a threat to the economy. So now turning to the fiscal situation, this is a graph that we spent a lot of time producing in the Fiscal Futures project. And what this graph shows is the state's fiscal balance. And you notice what we say is Illinois consolidated funds up there. One thing that you have to realize when you think about state fiscal situation is that it's a complicated picture. The state is got an account it calls the general fund account, which is essentially its checking account. That's the money that's about half of the money it's spending, roughly about $35 billion right now. But it also has many other accounts. These accounts typically house things like federal funds. They house funds for transportation, and many other funds. And often the news media and even many government reports focus on the general funds. We don't think that's a wise decision because it's easy to get confused. Funds often transfer, or spending often transfers between the general funds and the consolidated funds. And we therefore think it's important to look at a consolidated funds budget and to look at it in a very consistent way over time. So this graph represents a lot of work looking at government accounting reports and making sure they're consistent over time. And what you see here is a very volatile picture, but in general a negative picture. The lines below zero, which is almost all of the graph, show deficits. That is, the state is spending more than it's taking in revenues. And we see two periods where we see massive deficits, around 2000 and also around 2010. We see huge deficits, and then we see some recovery. This line, by the way, includes projections, so you might notice it goes all the way out to 2023. Obviously, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Up to 2014 or so, it's about 2013, it's actual data. But what we see is that we project deficits in the future based on historical experiences. We're actually in a relatively good period right now where we're closer to budget balance than we've been in a long time. We have deficits on the order of $1 or $2 billion for the current fiscal year. But those deficits we expect are going to increase, and they're going to increase largely because the tax rate, the state personal and corporate income tax rates, are scheduled to go back down beginning in January of 2015, and also because the historical experience is that spending grows faster than revenues. This shows a lot more detail on major categories of spending and sort of what's happened historically. Now, this is all historical data, and there's a lot of numbers and colors on there. But I want you to get the basic picture. The big blue chunk at the bottom is Medicaid. And you can see that that is rising. And it varies some, but that's a big chunk of government spending, and it's been rising over time. The second one, the orange chunk, is K-12 education. These are both very important, vital services that the government provides. The Medicaid one will rise more rapidly in the future because of the ACA and the increased roles of people on that program. But those expenditures are, supporting very vulnerable populations. K-12 education is a vital piece of expenditures for the state. And you can go through the other individual categories, but I think you should see that it's going to be very hard to cut spending without really cutting into things that we care a great deal about. So looking at the revenue side of the picture, in the next slide, this shows the major revenues. And one of the things that's often not realized when we look at revenues is the great importance of federal source income, which is the blue chunk at the bottom. That federal source income is partly Medicaid spending, largely Medicaid spending, but also federal grants for transportation and many other sources. And it's a very large share of our overall revenue, something about which we have limited control, and something about which we may have trouble in the future because the federal government faces its own fiscal crisis and is trying to control the increased spending. The other two major sources of revenue that the state has are the individual income tax and the state sales tax, the orange and the green chunks there. And of course, the individual income tax the rate is scheduled to fall, and that is something that will, is a major source of revenue, put us in difficult fiscal situation. The green section, the state sales tax, is also is growing very slowly because the types of goods that we apply the sales tax to, which are basically tangible goods, misses a large fraction of growth in the economy, which is services. And so the sales tax base is getting narrower and narrower, and Illinois has a particularly narrow sales tax base, so that those revenues are not going to grow very fast. So when we look at the fiscal future of the state of Illinois, we see revenue sources that are primarily slow growing, with the exception of the income tax, and we see expenditures that are focused on areas that are, probably will grow fast in the future, for which the need is growing, and that makes it very difficult to get a sustained budget balance, particularly in light of a political system that doesn't do a lot of long-term planning, and so isn't grappling with the sort of long-run issues in our fiscal situation. We aren't the only ones to notice this. This shows the bond rating agencies. There are 3 bond rating agencies, and the red blocks illustrate downgrades in the bond rating, Illinois' bond rating. And what you can see is that Illinois, over the past decade and a half or so, has experienced a long line of negative ratings and downgrades. It's now got, I believe, the lowest bond rating of any state in the country. And this, I don't think, represents the idea that the state is going to default, but it's generally a negative picture, and it's not so much a negative picture of the economy of Illinois, but a negative picture of the sort of political will to come up with a plan to have a long-term sustainable kind of budget. And I think, you know, connecting this to the sort of economic trends that I started out talking about, the concern is that this kind of pessimism about the fiscal situation could also lead to pessimism about the economic situation, and that could be a sort of self-reinforcing negative cycle that we're quite concerned about. So we've written a lot about this. There's a lot of things on our website. Chris mentioned the budget toolbox. There's also many articles elsewhere on that website, particularly in the fiscal futures section of it. And we often go back and deal on a regular basis with issues as they arise. We'll continue the project at least through next year, and so try and give updates and information about the biggest fiscal and public policy debates. So thanks for your attention, and that's our website where you can get more information. And I think I'm supposed to turn it back to Amy now to talk about the next speaker.
Well, here, this is Chris. Let me just introduce Fred Giertz. Fred Giertz is an economist on the faculty at IGPA, and he's been in the UIUC Department of Economics since 1980. He's been interim director of IGPA a couple of times, and he has his degree in economics from Northwestern. So Fred, would you like to take it away?
It's good to be here and happy to have a chance to talk with everyone. My role is a little bit unusual because I'm talking about why something needs to be done or what's going to happen if we don't do anything. So I rely very heavily on what David Merriman has just presented and what Dick Dye has been involved with. So the kind of rhetorical question that I ask is, are we not kind of alarmist here? Is it really as serious as we're saying it is? And the reason for that is that this problem goes back many years. I started doing this before Dick and David did, but it was on a much more casual and much less detailed kind of basis. But we've been talking about a structural deficit for at least 20 or 25 years. We've been talking about pension problems, all kinds of things that the state faces that they're not handling very well. And the question arises, well, if we've gotten through the last 20 or 25 years with these problems, what's different now? Why can't we just sort of go along the way we've been going? I call it a kind of muddle through strategy. May not be great, but why is action really necessary? So the first thing is that repeating just what the same information that was just talked about, we do have this long-term projected deficit that we have to deal with, but that's not new. We've had these kind of things in the past. And so the first answer is a fairly obvious one. We are not the federal government. The federal government has run deficits almost every year except like 1969 and around the year 2000. But all the other years we've had huge deficits. The debt's been growing more rapidly recent years and so on. So why are we different? Well, the main reason we're different is that we're a state government. We have limited powers. We don't have monetary powers, things of that sort. So our deficits have to be dealt with in a more direct, more kind of immediate way than the federal government. The federal government still has its long-term fiscal problems. They're not going to go away, but they do have some more things they could do than we do. A second answer is why don't we simply just wait and we'll grow ourselves out of the problem? This was the Edgar strategy in the early 1990s. He came into office with some severe fiscal problems, deficits, things of that sort. What he did was impart a little bit of austerity, slow growth of government programs, and the economy took off. And in kind of an unusual situation, in the late 90s, we actually had surpluses in the state of Illinois. So why can't we wait for that to happen again? Well, two reasons. One is we're in a much deeper hole than we were back in those days. And secondly, there's very little prospect, at least in most economists find, that we're going to have a kind of really rapid growth of what we had in the mid to late 1990s. So growing ourselves out of this is probably not a very viable option. Another kind of response might be, well, we've raised taxes for a few years. We've cleaned up some of our debts. We've had pension reform. Haven't we taken care of our problems? Why can't we just go back to a normal situation? Well, unfortunately, the pension reform falls far short of dealing with the long-term pension problem. And secondly, even with the tax increase the last 2 or 3 years, we still have huge backlog of unpaid bills, and when that goes away, the problem is going to be much greater. Now, one thing I should say here, I don't think we're advocating necessarily simply continuing the higher tax the way we have it now. We do need continuing revenue sources, but those revenue sources could be different from what we have now. So we're not saying keep the tax increase exactly the way it is, but we do need inflow of revenue. And so the next question is, well, how did we manage all these years when we're running deficits and we're still at least barely solvent, even though our credit rating is low, we can still borrow money at 0.5% or so, or maybe 1% more than other states. So people are still willing to lend us money. So why can't we just do the same kind of things we've done for these many years? Why do we have to take more drastic action? And the answer is that most of the ways we dealt with these problems were what I'd call temporary expedients. They work for a short time, but in most cases they actually tend to make things worse over the long term. So as you can see with the slide now, one way of responding is simply don't pay your bills on time. And the state of Illinois has done that year after year. We have a backlog of bills. So any one year you can, in a sense, balance your budget by not paying all of your bills, but then next year those bills are still there, plus the new bills. So it actually makes the hole deeper. So getting through 1 year does not necessarily make it better. It actually makes it worse for future years. Another way of doing things is to try to find ways to speed up revenue collections, collect your revenue more quickly. But again, like a tax amnesty would be an example of that, where you say we'll give taxpayers a month or two, and if you pay your taxes that are owed that you haven't paid, we'll not penalize you. Well, that brings a lot of money, but that money would have probably come in eventually, and you can only have an amnesty every 5-10 years, maybe not even that often. So again, an amnesty or other speed-up mechanisms help you in the short run. They don't really help you in the long run. The next one is pretty obvious. Borrowing for current operations is simply not a very good idea. Again, it gets you through the year, but next year you have the same spending obligations, but you also have the obligation of paying back the short-term borrowing. So we've done that very often, and now we're in a situation where we're paying a fairly huge penalty for not paying tax refunds on time, things of that sort, because we haven't got the resources to do that. Another long-term problem that's been around for almost forever in the state of Illinois is what I listed here as pension holidays. Now, a pension holiday, it would be somebody not funding pensions for a year. Now, we haven't taken, in most cases, full-fledged pension holidays, but we have cut back on our pension funding, underfunding pensions at various times. And as everyone knows, that has caught up with us. Our pension problem in Illinois is not so much that again, we have lavish benefits and abuse and things of that sort. There obviously are examples of abuse, but the main problem is that we didn't put the money in that we knew we had to when it was due. So an example, the General Assembly, the governor would say, well, We don't have as much resources we'd like this year. What do we do? Do we raise taxes? That's not a very popular thing. Do we cut back programs? That's not very popular. Why not simply not put as much in the pension fund this year? No one's going to do a big deal. We'll make it up later, and we'll just go along in that kind of way without much distress. Well, again, that works for 1 year or 2 years, but it doesn't work forever. And my example is that $100 million of underpayment back in 1980 now is $1 billion of shortfall because of the lack of the initial payment plus the lack of growth of the funds during that period of time. Another option is selling or leasing of assets. You could for example, sell or lease the lottery. The Chicago tollway. The tollway could be sold, a whole variety of things. And again, that's not necessarily a bad idea, but the problem is once you sell an asset, that asset is gone. You have the money, but you don't have the future income. So, for example, if we lease the lottery, you might get a huge amount of money right now, but then in the future, the money coming in from the lottery would go to the private owner or the private leasee, not necessarily to the state. And the other problem illustrated by the city of Chicago is that often there's not a lot of discipline involved here. The idea was when Chicago sold the Skyway, and when they sold the parking meter business, they were going to take in this money and then use it over a period of time. But what they did was use it almost immediately, and now they're in a situation where they spent most of the proceeds of the asset sales, and they no longer have the flow of income coming in that they had in the past. So that again is not a very good long-term kind of solution. And the final one we'll talk about here is that, as David mentioned and Dick will mention briefly, the state has many different sources of revenue, and we have a kind of archaic system where we have different funds. And the general fund is a kind of combination of funds that we usually think about. So if the state is short in one fund, they may have the option of draining down another fund to make up that shortfall. And again, it's not a good idea for two reasons. One is once you drain the fund, it's not there any longer, and you can't do it next year, so the hole reappears next year. And the funds that were taken out of the road fund, for example, if they go to someplace else, then can't be used to repair the road. So again, these are all kind of what I call expedients. They're not long-term kind of solutions. So again, we're in a bad but not catastrophic situation, but I don't think this can go on forever. So in terms of the toolbox, I started out with a quotation from Ernest Hemingway from The Sun Also Rises, and two people were talking to one another. One person had gone bankrupt, even though he seemed to be a pretty prosperous person, and the question was, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer was two ways, gradually at first and then suddenly. Well, we're in the gradually phase right now, and we can in fact move in some other directions, but again, gradually has a way of turning into a suddenly situation. And our example obviously is Detroit, which is not we're not saying Illinois is headed for Detroit's fate, but those kind of things can happen, and they can happen pretty suddenly. So doing nothing is really not a very viable long-term kind of option. Okay. So anyway, I'll be available for questions later.
Great. Thanks a lot, Fred. Finally, we have our other co-director of the Fiscal Futures team, and that's Richard Dye. He's a faculty member at IGPA. He's an economist as well. He's got his degree from the University of Michigan, and he is going to join us next. Are you there, Dick?
Yes, I am. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. And I will repeat some, but that's because repetition helps, and because we're all on the same team and have studied these issues together. So Illinois' fiscal problems way predate even the crash of 2008. They're chronic, and they still persist, even though a number of changes have been made. I'll show you a graph in a second, which graph is similar to one shown you by both of the previous speakers. A lot of the problems, as Professor Giertz just said in his slide labeled "Do Nothing," have to do with what I like to call time-shifting budget practices. Various sorts of buy now, pay later, where pensions are the big one. You buy the labor services now, but you pay with promises to take care of somebody after they retire. Buy now, pay later, or revenue time shifting, or one-time revenue sources, and so on. So time shifting is a big source of our current problem. The problems were not caused by, but were exposed by the crash of 2008. And since then, we've done a lot on the spending side. There have been a lot of cuts made, painful to many particular categories of recipients, social services, education, and so on. And in 2011, there was a number of temporary changes authorized. And most important among them was a big increase in income tax rates, both the personal income tax and the corporate income tax. You can see on the chart in front of you that the personal income tax rate went from 3% to 5% for 3 years, but then at the end of this calendar year, it's scheduled to go back down and then drop again in another 10 years. Same thing for the corporate rate, went from 4.8 to 7%, and then in 2 steps it's going to drop back down to 4.8%. So, as I said, we made a number of changes on the spending side, most of necessity. We passed this big temporary tax increase, and also just December of 2013, there were major changes to the pension law, which have big, especially long run, not much in the way of short run, but long run savings to the state. So a little bit about our fiscal futures model. It uses an all-fund, or what Professor Merriman called consolidated funds method, not just the 4 funds, and that's because of fund shifting. Another thing which Professor Giertz mentioned, where you can change the general funds budget, make it look more rosy by moving funds in from special purpose funds. But that's limited and exhaustible, as he explained. So we like this broader measure because you can't shift funds within this broader measure. We want to look at the realistic situation. It looks at the budget gap, the difference between total revenue and total spending. And then when we do our projections, we want to get the time-shifting elements out of there, so we focus on sustainable revenue, and that means we exclude 2 things: new borrowing and decreases in pre-existing fund balances. So you can spend what's available in either the general fund accounts, the financial assets linked to that fund, or other funds, but that's not sustainable, as astutely argued by Professor Giertz. So when we look at the revenue side of the budget, we take out the new borrowing and the pre-existing fund balances, and then we use that model to project out 10 or more years. And you've seen, concentrating on the red line, you saw that same line, but for more years, going back historically in a slide by Merriman. You saw that this, in a slide from Professor Giertz, that this is the difference between total revenue and total spending. He had those lines diverging up top and then linked to a green line, which here shows up as red. So after the new pension law, and assuming, which is a somewhat heroic assumption, assuming that this passed constitutional muster, we are looking at a deficit, a negative fund balance, a negative gap of about $1 billion for the current fiscal year, growing over time to about $12.5 billion. can see that. You can see that red line. The top line, the dotted line in this graph, is what if we kept the income tax rates up at their current 2014 levels and didn't have them drop in 2 stages in 2015 and again in 2025. You can see that that eliminates about half or more of the gap. But a point I want to emphasize here, and was made by both the previous speakers, does not eliminate the projected imbalance for the state of Illinois. So we've made big changes on the spending side already. We've cut pensions, and even if we keep taxes up at their current, not scheduled rates, we still have a remaining problem on the order of $1 billion, $2 billion for a number of years, and then growing to about $5 billion 10 years out. So the question becomes, we saw the numerical amount there, but the question becomes, should the 2011 tax increase be made permanent or allowed to expire as scheduled at the end of this calendar year at the beginning of 2015? You just saw that it eliminates about half the gap, half the amount that spending would otherwise have to be cut, or half the amount of other balancing changes that would have to be made. Indeed, when Governor Quinn proposed his budget for the upcoming fiscal year, 2015, he included a recommendation that the tax increase stay in place and not be cut. Now, he did, for political reasons, sweeten that to include greater property tax subsidies to individuals, but that just makes a bigger gap than my previous picture just said. So what the pros and cons are fairly simple. The pros, what we've already seen, and I'll go back a slide just to remind you of that the size of the gap, the solid red line, the size of the gap. This is something which by mere enactment could roughly cut the gap in half or more. That's the big, we're in such a big hole that Governor Quinn, I'm reading his mind, but surmise that it just isn't possible to undertake politically acceptable cuts that this tax increase or non-decrease is what we need to make things balanced. That's on the pro side. It's just the sheer magnitude of the mess we're in. On the con side, on the counter-argument side, I mean, of course, you could add a number of things that are in the political debate, like you promised. But there's 2 things to consider with the higher tax rates. One with the personal income tax, one with the corporate income tax. The higher rates leave, and I'll show you this in a second, the higher rates leave lower income families in Illinois with a relatively quite high tax rate. And similarly, the higher rate, if left on corporations, is very high compared to other states that have an income tax. Let's look at the first of these. Too much information here, but look at Illinois. We have this current 5% rate on everybody. It's a flat rate, unlike other states, some other states that have a progressive rate. There's a 5% rate on the lowest income people, and jump to the last column there, a married couple with just two deductions, no kids, would start paying that rate at only $4,200. That is a very high tax rate on low-income, working poor individuals. And that argues against that. Now, the governor in his proposal indeed recognized this problem and accompanied his proposal to keep tax rates up with a earned income tax credit that particularly benefits the low-income working poor. So keeping tax rates up has this problem, but keeping tax rates up as proposed by Governor Quinn takes away that sort of con or that counter argument because it has at the cost of a good bit of revenue, but it has that softening feature on this particular negative aspect. The corporate income tax. This is tricky to understand. I just said that the rate in Illinois is 7%, or we go back down to 4.8% in steps. But actually, there is another feature of Illinois taxes that adds 2.5% to that. It's something called the personal property replacement tax. We used to tax in Illinois in some places machinery and equipment as part of the property tax. When Illinois outlawed that, in order to get revenue to the local governments that were affected, they did this add-on to the corporate rate, 2.5%. But that's there, so it isn't 7%. It's 9.5%. That 9.5% rate is among the highest of all states with a corporate income tax. It is a very high rate. Iowa goes up to 12, but that's a progressive tax, and it goes up there only for the higher income corporations. So we took years, decades getting in this mess. The recession and the attendant effect on revenue collections exposed the fact that we had done years of these palliatives, these time-shifting practices, these okay to get you through a year but can't be sustained practices. So we got in this mess. We figured out what a big mess we were in the 2008, 2009, 2010 period. Changes on the spending side have been made since then, most notably and recently big cuts, if they withstand a constitutional challenge, to pension benefits. And we also have these temporary higher rates, which are currently in dispute, or the General Assembly is going to have to vote a budget, and it's a tough vote for them whether or not they vote for higher taxes or not lower taxes, whatever language you use for that. So I guess from here, it's question time.
Well, thanks a lot, Dick. And now the audience knows why they call economics the dismal science. This is a very bleak picture, and but one we think is realistic. So those of you who are listening, if you have questions, if you could please type them into the chat room feature in the bottom left corner of your screen, and Amy will read some off for us in the time we have left. Amy?
Hey.
Hey there, Amy.
There you go. Now you can hear me, I think. Thank you very much, Dr. Mooney. I really appreciate that. And I'm not going to give Dr. Dye credit for my beautiful graphic here. I imposed this into his slides, so this question time is all mine. I'm going to start off with one question we have in our chat box, and it is, are there opportunities for changes in the budget setting process that could help in our decision making? So I will let the presenters choose who wants to tackle that question.
I'd like to give it a try, but I think maybe Dick will particularly want to come in here as well. This is something that actually we've spent a lot of attention thinking about. It's a very good question. And I think it's important to understand, first of all, that there have been major changes in the budget setting process over the last few years. One very important thing that's been done is that the governor, for the first time, has been required to have a 3-year budget, which he presents to the legislature, and that while we applaud that, we think that there's a lot of things that could be done to make that more transparent and more detailed. We could go into details if people are interested about what's done there. The other thing that's been done, and I think this has been something we've been particularly concerned about, is that the legislative committees have begun looking much more broadly at all funds, not only the general funds budget. And we think that's really important. That's a process change rather than a legal change. But we've been down in Springfield, that is Dick and I and some of our other members have been down in Springfield a number of times explaining that to legislators and why we think that's important and how it might be done. The other thing that's been done is that there's a budgeting for results commission, and this budgeting for results commission is trying to look in detail at metrics for particular expenditure categories and to try and have a much more rigorous evaluation of which programs should and should not get funded. We have our own, and I think I'll ask Dick to talk a little bit about this. We have on our own come up with a list of about a dozen more things. I think maybe there's 10 things on our list now that we think could be done to make the budget setting process more effective. Dick, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. This is my soapbox, and this is a question I could have written myself. So thank you, whoever actually wrote it. We've tried to make sense out of the Illinois budget over the last 5 or more years, and it's very hard for those of us who specialize in it. Very recently, just this year, 2 national groups recommended that all states consider transparency or budget process reforms. There was a national task force on the state budget crisis chaired by Richard Ravitch, former Lieutenant Governor of New York, and Paul Volcker, former Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and they came down strongly in their recommendations for long-term planning by states, and a number of specific things that would make things more transparent and make it harder to do or harder to conceal fund shifting and time shifting practices. At the same time, that this business corporate financial type group came out with its recommendations. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, a very well-respected but labor liberal think tank, came out with a darn near identical list. Again, the bottom line is long-term financial planning and reporting practices that make it easier to see what the true nature of the problem is. Local groups have recommended the same thing. When I shop this idea with other people, it ain't sexy. Nobody says, yes, put me in line behind this banner. You all see it as a good idea, but it's sort of waiting for, because process isn't sexy. I mean, process can affect things greatly, but do you want to have your name as a legislator on some proposal called use a current services baseline, which every year say not just what did we spend last year on this particular program, but given the age and needs of the population that gets benefits, gets payments from that program, what is the amount we would need to spend to keep things level? Say if there's growing school-age populations or growing illness or whatever. So this is to me huge. We'll see what happens politically.
Anyone else?
Thanks, Dick. Amy?
Okay. The next question is, if the tax rates are high and the state continues to have budget problems, is that the mismanagement problem you mentioned?
Again, I'm happy to talk about this. I think it's what Dick said is not that the income tax rate is high, but that the tax rate on low-income folks is particularly high. So we have a flat rate, and we have a very low exclusion for low-income households, which makes our tax system much less progressive than other states. I think the general judgment, there's lots and lots of ways you can look at this data, is that Illinois is sort of pretty much the middle of the pack with respect to revenue raising and spending. It's not a high spending state, it's not a low spending state. That's my judgment based on a lot of data. The sales tax in Illinois is a relatively high rate and is particularly badly formulated, I think, compared to other states. Certainly there are management problems in Illinois. I'm not sure the management problems in Illinois in terms of operating the budget are worse than in other states. We have a large concentration of low-income population. We have 20% of our population on Medicaid, and that's been particularly problematic. So I'm not sure that I would say that the way government services in Illinois are delivered are particularly worse than the average state in the nation. I don't know whether either of my colleagues would want to comment on that.
This is Giertz. Let me make a kind of slightly tangential remark, but it relates to what we're talking about. I think that the people listening might think that we're giving a kind of carte blanche endorsement of continuation of the higher rates. That's not exactly what we're saying. We're saying we need a continued revenue source more or less equivalent to the higher tax rates, but in our opinion, that's not the best way to do it. There are a variety of ways you could raise the revenue by reforming the income tax, changing the sales tax, things of that sort to produce the same amount of revenue in a more efficient manner. And we could even address some of the issues that Dick Dye talked about. It would be possible to have a higher exemption level and a higher tax rate and give more relief to low-income people and still raise the same amount of revenue. The other thing, which David mentioned briefly, one of the problems with Governor Quinn's proposal, which I think are understandable for political reasons, is that even though he wants to continue the higher tax rate, he actually spends a considerable portion of that for new programs that wouldn't be able to go to deal with the structural deficit. So there are a lot of fine-tuning issues here that we really haven't had time to talk about.
Well, I think we have probably time for one more quick question, right, Amy?
Right. We have, what concern do you have that the increase in revenue due to the increase in income tax rates will hit your targets if kept due to the November to February loss of 116,000 workers?
Well, I can speak briefly to that. I mean, that's a concern, but the income tax revenue actually has been holding up pretty well this year, and we haven't had any. We've met and more than met our expectations. So obviously, job loss is a problem, but I don't think it's really undermining the revenue base to a very major extent.
Okay. There's one more question in the chat box. Maybe we can address it very briefly. Has there been research on the elasticity of the relationship between business location decisions versus corporate tax rates? Could a friendlier business environment in the form of lower corporate tax rates actually lead to larger corporate tax revenue?
Well, actually, I've just recently done some research on that question. So the corporate income tax is a very complicated thing. In Illinois, it's apportioned based on sales, which means that the location of your employment is essentially irrelevant to the tax that you pay in Illinois. the corporate income tax that you pay in Illinois. What it depends upon is how much, what share, at least for multi-state corporations, what share of your sales are in Illinois. The evidence is very weak that the corporate income tax influences the location of employment. I think a much bigger concern is general long-term fiscal stability and confidence in government than the actual corporate tax rate. You know, that would be my take on that issue.
And I think also the question maybe is even more direct. That I think it's quite unlikely that lowering the rates will raise revenue. Sort of Laffer curve phenomenon, but still that doesn't mean it wouldn't be a good idea. And the other problem, or related problem, is it's not just that Illinois has a very high corporate tax rate. The United States actually has one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, and you add that national rate to the Illinois rate, and it becomes a pretty substantial rate. So again, I don't think it's a magic or silver bullet, but something that certainly has to be considered.
Well, thanks a lot, Fred, Dick, and Dave. This is we're going to wrap it up now. Those in the audience found this useful. Please stop in on June 10th, as it says here, at the same time, same place. We'll be talking about revenue options from the Illinois Budget Policy Toolbox, sin taxes, business taxes, and sales taxes with Dave Merriman, and Fred Giertz will be back, but also we'll have Julian Reif on the phone, another one of our economists. Thanks for joining us.